Should you buy a vintage cassette deck? Or any cassette deck? Hey, welcome to Lancaster Hi-Fi. Let's talk cassette decks. But, I'm gonna need a drink for this one. So buckle up. Okay, let's get to it. The short answer is, run away! Well, vintage is your only choice here, and you should generally avoid cassette decks altogether unless you really need one. If you've seen my recent videos, you'll know I'm relatively positive about streamers and CD players, including vintage players, and enthusiastically positive, with appropriate reservations, about vintage turntables. Why do I say you should stay away from cassette decks? Because they're horrible on so many levels. Cassette tapes are low-quality, fault-prone media, and cassette decks are generally awful. Let's talk about the media and decks in turn. Do I really need to tell you how bad cassettes are? Their frequency response doesn't cover the full audible range. If you want to get the highest possible extension into the treble, you'll have to forego Dolby noise reduction and tolerate hiss. More about friggin' Dolby later. With Dolby, in ideal conditions, the treble range is truncated enough to sound muted. Did I mention hiss? It's pretty bad. Signal-to-noise ratio is worse than for vinyl records. The tapes don't accumulate additional noise, like pops and clicks, like vinyl does, but the sound quality does degrade over time, even if the player is perfectly maintained. If the player is not perfectly maintained, it will eat your tape at some point. After that, your tape will have a garbled section in the best case. In the worst case, the tape will be effectively destroyed, and you'll be lucky to salvage the player. If you've forgotten about tape-eating decks, let me remind you. Fucking hell. You're happily listening to your music when it starts sounding garbled. You're not super savvy on why it sounds funny, or you're not right next to the machine, and the garbling gets worse. Eventually, the tape player stops. When you eject the cassette, you find the tape is entangled in the mechanism. Specifically, the tape is wrapped around the pinch roller. You try to pull the tape out, and you're successful at unwinding a bunch of it, but a significant amount is stuck. You try to untangle it, but eventually you have to cut the tape and pull off the remaining tangle piece by piece. If the player is part of a car stereo, you never get all the tape out and your tape deck is ruined. Of course, your cassette tape is ruined. Maybe you splice the ends together with Scotch tape, but maybe one or both ends gets pulled into the reel. Now you either have to dismantle the shell or, more likely, toss the cassette into the trash. As you gain experience with cassette decks, you learn to recognize the early signs of mangling and can usually hit stop before the tape gets wound onto the roller too tightly to remove. Still, your tape is slightly crumpled and the spot is audibly degraded thereafter. As you gain even more experience, you learn to maintain your player well enough to prevent entanglement for a long time until one day, no amount of cleaning can keep all of your tapes safe. Is it coming back to you now? Have I triggered an episode of PTSD? So, if cassettes were so awful, why were they so popular for so long? Well, pre-recorded cassettes were very popular in the 80s and 90s. But if you were an audiophile, you generally avoided those and bought your music on vinyl and/or CD. However, if you wanted to listen to your music elsewhere, then you recorded your albums and CDs to cassette tape. You may also have done so to preserve your records. If you wanted to make a mixtape, you used a cassette. I could get nostalgic about mixtapes. If you were having a party, a standard part of preparation was making a mixtape. Mixtapes were also popular gifts between friends and lovers. Me, I routinely recorded my favorite records, and I made a lot of mixtapes. In the latter half of the 80s, I regularly visited New York City. I'd go to Uncle Steve's on Canal Street and buy a box of 10 TDK 90-minute metal tapes, or maybe Maxell. I had a Sony Walkman for a while, and I used it a lot. It was too big to fit in my pocket, so I clipped it to my belt or waistband. Ah, yes, music on the go. So nice. So cool. Wired headphones and machines with moving parts. And so many dead batteries. As the tape finally came to a stop. So we all used cassettes and had cassette decks. We recorded our friends' records. Oh, we were bad. An earlier generation used reel-to-reel tapes and players, but we had cassette decks. And by we, I mean everyone. Everyone had a turntable and a cassette deck, and we also listened to the radio. Cassette decks were great, because we didn't have anything better. But let's face it, cassettes sucked, and we were happy to be done with them. Now, looking back with fondness and nostalgia, we've forgotten about that suckiness. And since we've got our vintage gear thing going, maybe we should complete the system with a cassette deck. You might have good enough reasons to go down that road, but generally I recommend that you steer clear of cassette decks. Why? And have I followed my own advice? Sadly, I have not. But that's why I can speak on the matter with some authority. Let's break it down. But where to begin? Long story short, cassette decks aren't worth the trouble, and they are trouble. Every time I've tried to fix a cassette deck, I've been sorry. The last and easiest time, I found that the Playhead had a crust of oxide residue reminiscent of the hard surface of creme brulee. It took seemingly endless swabs and alcohol to get it all off. The good news was that it sounded great when I was done, but then I got a message from the person who bought it. It was making a horrible screeching sound. I said, "Bring it over. I'll see what I can do." I lubed the capstan. To do so, I removed a little E-clip, which I then lost inside the deck. I had to order a box of assorted clips. Then I tried and tried to get some oil onto the spindle of the capstan motor and hence into the motor. I failed until I bought some syringes. And then it was relatively easy. So turns out that screeching motors are pretty common. The very worst failure mode is an old belt, or more than one, that's turned to goo. Many of the belts used in especially 80s and 90s cassette decks degrade into a viscous tar that is difficult to remove. Difficult? It's a horror show. It gets all over the place. It is such a pain to remove. But say you keep the heads, roller, and capstan clean and catch the belts and tires before they turn to goo. They will still need to be replaced. The belts will go slack and start slipping. The tires will get hard and smooth and start slipping. Say you're really lucky and you can get a belt kit from... Sweet! The kits come with detailed directions. And it's a good thing because you'll have to dismantle the mechanism. And every deck has a different mechanism. Okay, maybe not everyone, but I have found that dismantling one mechanism does not make the next one any easier. They all cram too much stuff into a small space. And, well, that design kind of sucked, so let's do it differently on the next one, and so on. Yep, they kept trying, so they're all different. And what do you think those little parts are made of? There are some metal parts, but mostly the mechanism is made of plastic. White, nylon, plastic. The kind that eventually cracks and can't be glued back together. If one of those pieces comes apart, maybe you can have a new one made on a 3D printer, but is it worth the trouble? Maybe. Let's say everything works, but your deck needs a fine-tuning. The heads need aligning and demagnetizing, and the demag units are pretty standard and easy to come by, but various arcane and obscure adjustments of the electronics are required. To make those adjustments according to the service manual, you'll need a special calibrated cassette tape. Good news, people still sell those for ballpark $100 each. You might need 2 for one player, and those are different for every make, and sometimes even models of the same make. Pioneer? What year? Well, with the Playhead, you can probably wing it. Just turn the screw to get the best sound. The screw? My Nakamichi has like 2 or 3. I can't even tell. I replaced the belts and tires, and now it just sounds like shit. I replaced the belts and tires on my Pioneer, and it sounds pretty good. But it sometimes fails to pull the reel and jams. And speaking of adjustments, let's talk about Dolby. 'Cause that's one of the adjustments you need that special tape for. Dolby fucking sucks! Okay, if you use metal tape, Dolby can sound pretty good as long as you only ever play the tape on the same deck that you recorded it on. Otherwise, fuck it, forget it. You want to play it in your car with Dolby? Forget about it. It's going to sound like shit. Dolby fucking sucks. I never used fucking Dolby, which means every tape started with that which, kinda nostalgic looking back on now. It's sort of like the needle drop, that rush in your ears of that horrible hiss. God. So, how many cassette decks do I actually have? 1, 2, 3, 4? Yeah, I have several. Yeah, I know. But why? Because I have some tapes with music that can't be found elsewhere. I had friends who made some good music in the 80s. At least I like it. And none of them ever got record deals. They made some tapes, though. Both live and studio recordings. I still have the tapes. I'd really like to be able to listen to them. And that, my friends, is the only good reason to get a cassette deck. You have music that's only on cassettes. Music you don't want to lose. Music that means something to you. Then get a cassette deck. Just prepare yourself for the struggle. But maybe you'll get lucky and find one in great shape. Or find someone who feels obligated to fix it. Good luck. I'll keep you in my thoughts. Hey, if you enjoyed the video, give it a like. Subscribe to the channel. That would be awesome. Leave me a comment. Tell me your favorite cassette or your worst cassette story. Cheers, everyone. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you soon.
Well,